My name is Richard Tankard. I was born in Nassawadox in 1966 at the old hospital, some people called it. And I've lived on the Eastern Shore from 66 until 2011. Family history goes back to the 1660s. First ancestor that we know of here was the first practicing attorney in Northampton County.
Wow.
And that was discovered by a friend of mine who actually has transcribed a lot of the records. Northampton County court records, Dr. Harold Mackey. He's the one that made me aware of that. It's kind of a neat thing. I think sometimes the weather, the vagaries of the weather have ingrained sometimes maybe a cautious optimism in people from the Eastern Shore. They probably aren't braggarts. People on the Eastern Shore, if you were involved in farming, you could have a beautiful crop of potatoes, one that's just going to turn into a tremendous harvest. And 2 days before the harvest, a hurricane comes and wipes you out. So you never, as they'd say, count your chickens before they hatch. But I think there is a tendency not to brag, not to toot your own horn here, because, well, what you thought you had could be wiped out in a short amount of time. And I'm trying to think of a better way to explain that, but I'm trying to think of some of the Eastern Shore expressions sometimes you'll hear, and I think it has roots in that, whether it's where I imagine so. Sometimes you'll hear people that they sort of hedge their bets. How's it going? Oh, pretty good. You don't hear people from the Eastern Shore saying, it's going great. You know, it's more pretty good, because you don't know what tomorrow's going to be like. And with farming, and most people being so dependent on farming up through at least the 30s, I think that's somewhat ingrained in us that, well, you just don't know. And I've seen it here sometimes, having been in the horticulture business, have great crops of something, and hurricane came along, and all of a sudden they're all bent over. Or a northeaster, or northwester. Northwesters can wreak more havoc than a hurricane.
What was it like growing up here?
For me, it was a lot of fun because I had both opportunities of living on the water, Warehouse Creek, and on a farm, about a 102-acre farm along the creek. So in the summertime, lots of those boating activities, and I can get into greater detail with those. And then on the farm, just being able to have the space to roam around the woods. Part of the farm was woods and open field, about half and half. So spent a lot of time in either the woods or the fields. Mm-hmm. For me, it was a great outlet because I wasn't great at sports. So water activities I could do pretty well at. Learned how to water ski and got good at it. My brother was instrumental in actually setting up a slalom course on Warehouse Creek. And so lots of summers, he was 3 years older, after his work finished, and whether I was working or not, it was on the boat, water skiing, doing the ski course. And that was the way we could compete amongst ourselves. Mm-hmm. And at that time, even this was the late 70s, we even had the Parks and Rec in Northampton County actually sponsored a water ski tournament. And so we had that for maybe 3 or 4 years. And we did well with that. That was a lot of fun. Because the creek was somewhat, when you were young, you didn't have a driver's license and get around by car. So you got around by boat. Mm-hmm. And some of the families that we knew on the creek sort of had this system of getting to know the water, getting to know boats in an incremental way. And they would, the first year when you were, say, probably 8, 9, 10, along in there, you had a rowboat. And you rowed around the creek. And you saw your friends by rowboat. And I had some friends that had the same thing. They had a rowboat. So we rowed around. The first summer was rowing around. Then the next summer you had like a 10 horsepower Johnson or something. A friend of mine had Doug Bernard had a 3 horsepower British Seagull. And so that was how we got around. And then the next year we graduated a little farther. He had a 25 Johnson and I had a 35 Johnson. And so, of course, we probably didn't call each other much. We just got out on the creek, buzzed by somebody's house that you knew. Come on out, let's go do something. So it's very informal, not very well planned or anything like that. In general, one of the things that the adults on the creek got going was what they called the Warehouse Creek Racing Association. And Harry Holcomb, who lived next door to me, was really instrumental in starting that. So that was a competitive sailing organization, started about 1979, 1980. And he even had, during the off season, he gave a couple sailing clinics and things like that, and got people that lived on the creek interested in sailing. So usually it was either 4 or 5 regattas we would have spaced out during the summer, one in May, one in June, July, August, and then finish in September. And that was fun because it was competitive, and he used the Portsmouth handicap system, which allowed people that sailed on, say, a catamaran like me. I was sailing on a Hobie 14, and he was sailing on a Mobjack. It was a handicap system, so we could still compete against each other. So you would rotate around the creek, usually Warehouse Creek or Church Creek or Nasquatix Creek. Somebody would host a race. Like Burr Wilcox, who lived on Nasquatix Creek, would host it, or the Bernards would host it. Philip Bernie Tankard would host one. And but then there was also a social element to that, because you had a race, and then you went on shore, you sort of talked about the race and socialized with some people that were just social members. And at one point in time, in the early 80s, we'd even have maybe up 18 to 20 boats out on the creek. And it was good fun. And for me, it was a lot of fun too, because I have a competitive side, and I like to win races. So it allowed, and I sailed a lot, so I practiced a lot, and it paid off. So that was probably one of the highlights of summer for me as a teenager. Fishing wasn't as a big thing for me. Maybe it was because my father wasn't a very good fisherman. So we had good fishing trips, not many of them though. Probably with my grandfather. He was of that kind of earlier era with a bigger boat that he would like to take trips across the bay sometimes and stay overnight, 1 or 2 nights on the other side, take his grandkids with him. And he had sort of a social group that would do that with him, and don't see that too often anymore. But like a 30, 35-foot boat that could sleep 6 or 8 people or something like that. Mm-hmm. So that was fun. No, really, for me, the creek really revolved around sailing, mostly, and water skiing. Because one of the main things, I guess, too, was my brother was a really good water skier, and so I couldn't beat him at that, but I could beat him at sailing. I think when I was much younger, you knew farmers more than now, because today there might be close to the same amount of farmland. Sure, we've lost a little bit of farmland to subdivisions, but not much. But farms, when I was young, were smaller, and farmers might have 150 to 300 acres, and they grew some vegetables, and grains were sort of something to rotate with their vegetables. Now we're about the same amount of farmland, but fewer actual farmers, because they farm 1,000, 2,000, maybe even more acres. So I say that because you could very well live on the shore now and maybe not know a farmer. But when I was young, knew lots of farmers, and those are people that were they were the backbone of the community. Mm-hmm. There's just not many of them around anymore. Mm-hmm. But yet their farmland's all around us, we still see it. Mm-hmm. And what you see in the farm has changed some too, because there's fewer vegetables. You might see some potatoes here. and not very little vegetables like cucumbers, tomatoes. You do see the more industrial tomatoes still here. But when I was young, you hardly saw corn. You see a lot of corn now. So a lot of the grain being produced is headed north for the chicken poultry industry. One of my favorite memories living on the farm was I remember in third grade, after for the whole summer, leased a pony and rode that pony about every day all over the farm. And my father, when he'd get home from work, he would saddle up my mother's horse. She didn't ride much, but he rode it instead. And we would trail ride around the farm, but then we'd cross over. We lived down Elliott's Neck, so we would cross over into another area, Mr. Treehern's farm and other areas, because there weren't any houses there at that point in time. There were just empty farms, and we rode around then too. So you sort of, into Scott Farm, we would go to home place, what they call it. So you sort of range wide, a lot of freedom involved with that. And just shared experiences with your dad. It's hard to trade anything for that. I'd probably want to mention too another place that my family has a farm still in the family, and it's a farm that my grandfather bought at auction in 1930. It actually came in two parts down Savage's Neck, just north of what they call the Sand Hills, and so it was 40 acres on the bay, farmland, and it had an old farmhouse on it. And oftentimes my aunt and uncle, David and Suzanne, would take me there as a child because my first cousins, their children were same age. And it was great because, again, that big freedom to just roam around the farm that happened to be right on the Chesapeake Bay. So sometimes entertainment was playing around in the potato field, throwing what we would call dirt clogs at each other, hiding behind potato rows and bombing each other. Mm-hmm. And then when we got all dirty, we'd just run down, jump in the bay and clean up. But the farmhouse was really rustic. You just swept it out. And so it made for lots of freedom to roam. We would, early in the morning, before anybody else, the adults would get up, we would walk down about a mile south and climb the big hills of the Sand Hills. And when you get to the top, you can see the other side of the bay really easily. So yeah, a great deal of independence and being able to enjoy the natural environment. I think I was really fortunate. A lot of kids that didn't live on a farm or on the water didn't have that same experience. So I feel very fortunate to have had that. I guess if I was pigeonholed, I would have been a Baysider, even though I appreciate the seaside a lot, have ancestors that lived on Hog Island after all. Seaside was, and just like it is today, less accessible. And you certainly heard stories of, well, people went out there and they ran aground and left high and dry. So we took occasional trips out there. My parents really got much more interested in it when I was in late high school, and we would go out from Willis Wharf, go out to south end of Hog Island, north end of Cobb Island, either go clamming or just walking on the beach there. I think my favorite memory of that was actually I was home for Thanksgiving from college, and my dad said, "Hey, let's go. We're going to go out to Hog Island with the two Bowens. I think it was Harvey Bowen and Grafton Bowen, and they were going to go out and check on the Red Onion. The Red Onion was owned, I'm not sure who owns it now exactly, but the Purnell brothers were part owners of that. It's an octagonal cabin out on the south end of Hog. And we went out on just a perfect day, and it was like glass. So we traveled right across Hog Island Bay, and I remember sitting up on the bow of the boat, and Mr. Bowen was steering, and you just knew he knew exactly where to go, and had done it probably thousands of times in his life. and looking down, and the water was so slick that you could see your reflection the whole way. The boat was the only wake in the whole Hog Island Bay. And we got out there, and the project for those two guys was they had to restart a pickup truck. That was one of the Purnells. I think they had a pickup truck out on Hog Island, and Grafton got that going and drove it. I think the idea was to bring it back up to the road, to the Red Onion. So I rode with him in this old beat up truck on the beach, just Grafton, Bowen, and me, and having the whole island to yourself. He you know, and low tide, and you could cruise up and down the beach, and sure enough, that was probably the last time that pickup truck ever ran, because I remember finding it years later. It was on the little causeway between the North Island station and the beach, and it was this little rusted hulk, not much left of the body, a little bit of a motor, and so I used to always say, well, I was the last man to ride in Grafton Bowen's pickup. I think two of my favorite places on the shore to visit are gone now. One of them was that beach farm, we call it the beach house. That burned down about 9 years ago. So it's sort of not quite the same. And it's an area called Tankard's Beach. It's sort of hard to describe how unique it is to be at a place where farmland meets bay, because there's just not that many of them around anymore. That's still probably one of my favorite places, that along with the sand hills. And the other one is gone now too. That burned down probably 6 years ago. That was the North End station at Hog Island. That was a 1963 station, and I spent a couple nights out there a couple different times. But it's truly hard to describe when you spend a night on a place with at an old Coast Guard station that used to be extremely regimented, and everything still. That station was owned by the Conservancy, but it had people that had retired from the Coast Guard that actually had served out there, so they had put things kind of back in the order, similar to the way the Coast Guard had it, and still had the bunk rooms, and so. But yet you woke up in the morning, you were the only people on the island, and you could look out through the expanse, and there was a little bit of height. And one of the things that you notice, if you can get some height on the shore, like Gordon Campbell does it so well in his photographs. A really neat place is, and it's last time I've been up there was probably 30 years ago, the lighthouse on Smith Island. And if you go up at the top there and you look down, and you really just see these beautiful curvatures and natural beauty, but yet it seems to have some kind of natural rhythm that you don't see from ground level, where you see the lines where upland meets marshland. Sometimes it's just a straight line, or like waves of myrtle groves amongst marsh. It seems to have a certain rhythm and beauty that, I guess it's sublime. It's not big beauty like, say, the Grand Canyon or something.